Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Macro Pro and Friends. I'm Diane Cohen, Vice President of Client Services and the Education Department. Today, I am joined by Jenna, and Jenna and I just found out something very interesting. Jenna and I are both identical twins. That does not happen very often where I find that information out. So, Jenna, my parents always dressed us in red and blue so that people can tell the difference between us. What did your mom do?
Mine was purple and my sister was pink. So
Oh, very interesting. Well, thank you for joining us on this summer school series. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and your company?
absolutely. So my name is Jenna, as Diane had mentioned. I am a business development liaison for Learning Services, a Collage rehab partner. We provide post-acute neuro rehab services. So all different therapy services for injured workers, primarily for catastrophic injuries. And my role specifically for the program is educating, payers, nurses, family members about the program, making sure that they have a good understanding of what we can provide, and then helping to get an individual actually into the program by doing an evaluation on them.
Great. And then, hopefully we can get that injured worker as close to 100% as possible. So this is our
100%.
summer school series, and I start out with a question. So Jenna, why don't you ask today's question of the day, and we can see how our attendees are going to answer them, because I love that. So if you're an attendee, please, please, please take the moment to answer the question, because we love to see what you guys are thinking and how you guys are on a personal basis.
So we wanted to ask a question related to summer. My question for you is, do you prefer going to the beach or the mountains? So, if you are more of a beach person or prefer going to the mountains.
Right now, everybody's putting down beach, beach, beach. Neither. Oh, Amelia says neither. I wonder what he would like. So what would you like instead? We would love to hear that. We got April is also a beach person. We got mountain, whichever's cooler. I know the person, Stephanie, are you in Sacramento or Northern California? I hear they're having a heat wave right now. Barbara says beach. Let's see here. Christina said beach. Heidi also said that. Oh, there's Goins. I had a neighbor's last name was Goins. All right, so keep them coming. While you're putting these into the question box, I'm going to do a little bit of business. I want to remind you that today's program is worth 1 CEU. You should receive that in 1 hour as long as you're logged on to the GoToWebinar platform, which means you have to use their link in order to get on. If you phone in alone, I'm sorry, they can't take your time in attendance and will not be able to send a certificate to you. If you have any questions, please put them in the same box. You're telling us if you like the beach or the mountains. And then there is a handout. So if you look a little bit below the question box, you'll see where it says handout. And Jenna has got some very good handouts there. So I am going to turn this over to you, Jenna. I'm going to look at the responses that we get, and I will see you in roughly 55 minutes. Now, we would like to say if you do have any questions, again, put them in the question box, because we will be looking at those, I think, partway through the program.
Perfect. Thank you, Diane. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. So I'm going to move over to the next slide. Again, if you have any questions throughout, feel free to put it in the question box. I want this to be as engaging of a conversation as possible. I know I will be talking for the majority of it, but don't hesitate to put questions in the box throughout the presentation, because I will stop about halfway through to go through any questions that there might be. All right, so today we are talking about how to promote long-term return to work success. A little background about me, actually, which I didn't mention when Diane introduced me. I am an occupational therapist by background. Before I worked for Learning Services, I worked in an inpatient rehabilitation setting, an acute rehab program. So I often worked with individuals with their ultimate goal being return to work. So it may have been, an individual that had a brain injury or spinal cord injury. And a lot of times a big focus of rehab, kind of down the line would be how can we, personalize their rehab program to work on different activities that they need for return to work. All right, so the objectives for today are first to understand considerations made for return to work after a catastrophic injury. I'd like everyone to learn about 2 assessments or measures used to help promote return to work success. And then finally, discuss the frequency of communication methods and workplace modification strategies to promote long-term return to work success. So before we get started, a little statistics for everybody. When looking at the research and different articles that have been published, I really focused on return to work rates for catastrophic injuries primarily because that is the area that my company works on. There are rates all across the board depending on what type of injured worker you're working with. So to start, return to work rates for an individual that has suffered a moderate or severe TBI, it really varies, but it's typically between 35 and 50%. For people with a mild TBI, the proportion of return to work is higher. It's usually about 89% within the first 12 months after injury. With all injuries, the more time that has gone by, the less a chance is that they will return to work. For spinal cord injury, statistics are again all over the place because it just depends on what's reported, what type of injury is present, if it's a complete spinal cord injury or an incomplete spinal cord injury. But research indicates that only 12% of spinal cord injury patients return to their pre-injury professions, with an average rate of employment of 35%. So obviously an individual that has suffered a spinal cord injury is, living with long-lasting physical deficits. So if it is somebody that was injured on the job in a physically demanding environment, then obviously those statistics make a lot of sense. The last one I did is chronic pain. So after a serious musculoskeletal injury, a very, very common reason for, having to leave work is chronic pain. Research indicates about 70% of individuals will return within the first 6 months, depending on what injury it is. However, again, with more passing time, the less a chance there is for them to return to work. So after 2 years out of the workforce, somebody typically will have less than a 10% chance of returning back to work. So I find these statistics very interesting. There is no 100% return, of course. There are individuals that choose to do something else. And then, of course, there are individuals that are kind of in this middle ground process of hoping to return to work in the future. So, along with obviously all of the physical factors that go into an injured worker returning to work, there are personal and social factors. So I wanted to highlight, what those factors are. Personal factors that influence return to work, the first one is attitude. So of course, an injured worker may have a lot going through their mind. There is, a lot to do with a person before their injury, of course. So what is their psychological readiness? How motivated are they to return to work, to return to their structured routine? Self-efficacy. So there is a scale called the return to work self-efficacy scale. Basically, more or less trying to determine how motivated somebody is to return to work and how ready they are to return to work. Another factor is age as a personal factor. So research shows that the younger a person is, the more likely they are to return to work, versus if somebody gets injured maybe towards the end of their career, they might not be as likely to return or want to return. Education level is another one. So those with a lower or less, years of education are less likely to return to work than those with a higher education level. And then, as I said with the statistics, length of absence. So as more time goes by, it is harder and harder to influence that individual to return to work. So I think that really is a testament to kind of human nature. Of course, the longer you are away from something, the harder it is to return. If people take a break from their current role or from the workforce for a long period of time, there is this big intimidation aspect to it, right? Are there going to be the same coworkers that I'm going to work with? What is the structure? Am I going to be able to do the same thing that I was doing before, because I have all of these other things that I'm dealing with now? So as you can see as time goes on, the length of absence increases and it's harder and harder to return to that job. I wrote gender and SES on the bottom. There isn't too much evidence supporting gender and SES, but most of the research that I found says typically a female might be less likely to return to work, and those with a lower socioeconomic status as well. But again, that research is a bit limited. So what are some social factors that influence a person's return to work? The level of support from leadership. So this one was all across the board, a big social factor that influences individuals. I think when those, injured workers work for a very large company, you don't know if they're, talking with leadership, if they have supportive leadership, if they know who their leadership is. So what is that level of support from the leaders in the company? What's the level of support from colleagues? Have colleagues reached out to that injured worker to say, I'm covering you while you're away? Have they shown in the past that they're able to cover or able to kind of mentor or facilitate their job with them? Family and friend support is huge. So if there's an injured worker that, doesn't have a lot of family or friend support throughout their injury and upon their return, then it shows that those, are unfortunately a poor influence on what those outcomes will be in their return to work. And then social integration in general. So again, with that intimidation factor of being away from work and then coming back to work, if you had a big injury and you may have, been in a facility and then in a hospital and then in a rehab and then at home, you aren't around a lot of individuals and you might be very nervous about how you're able to present yourself. You might be, intimidated to be around coworkers who know you as one thing and then you're showing up as another. So the social integration factor is huge, and I think that really is a testament to why, rehab in the community and getting an injured worker out and about a bit is just so important, because it's not just their physical and their cognitive abilities that play into their return to work. It is their comfort levels and their ability to interact with their coworkers and, just their overall interaction with everyday human beings, of course, outside of the healthcare industry. So again, with statistics, factors that negatively associate return to work following injury. So older age, female sex, lower occupational skill level, lesser pre-injury paid work hours, and then more physically demanding occupations, which makes sense, of course. If somebody has, a catastrophic injury that affects their physical abilities and they are expected to return to a physically demanding job, that return is a little bit more difficult to facilitate. What is their pre-injury health? So those with a chronic illness have a harder time returning to work. Individuals that have experienced psychological factors like post-traumatic stress or depression. Again, with that injury, it really depends. Do they have PTSD from the injury itself? Did they suffer these psychological factors before? So that plays into their return as well. The injury severity. So as you could guess, obviously, if it is a more catastrophic injury, there will be, more time that passes and a harder time for that return to work. And then a high initial pain and disability. So if they are reporting a lot of pain initially and are highly disabled, then their return to work will be a lot more difficult. Decreased support from social network is another one. And then this one is interesting. Involvement in injury compensation claims processes is associated with poor post-injury physical and psychological health. There's no getting around that. Of course, if they're involved in a compensation claim, that is something that they are dealing with, but of course that might be negatively impacting their psychological health. They might be more stressed about it, might not be able to dedicate as much time, as much brain power to their rehab program, and in turn, does play a role into their return. So objective 2 is to learn about 2 assessments and measures currently being used to help promote return to work success. So many of you have maybe have heard of these assessments and others may have not. The 2 assessments that are most common, I would say, are the functional capacity evaluation and the readiness for return to work scale. So I'm going to take time just to kind of go over both of these. So the functional capacity evaluation. So this is a pretty broad scale and evaluation. There are multiple different ways of doing a functional capacity evaluation, but it's basically a series of questions and measures that are looking at somebody's physical abilities, the cognitive abilities and the demands of the job, and then where that person, kind of lands. So it might look at their muscle strength, their grip and pinch strength, their endurance over a period of time. And then from a cognitive standpoint, it might look at their cognitive endurance. Are they able to focus on, doing an activity for 30 minutes, 45 minutes before making mistakes or getting fatigued? Are they able to, alternate attention between a computer screen and a phone and somebody in the room at the same time? So there are different ways of doing a functional capacity evaluation, but this is definitely one of the most common assessments that's used for return to work. So some of the pros for an FCE is, a strong FCE is pretty comprehensive, like I said. It'll be done across several days and weeks, and it'll be specific to that individual. So again, with functional capacity evaluations, there are very standardized generic ones. But what if that person, doesn't have a physically demanding job, but cognitively, they really need to be on top of it and focus on multiple things at once? And, on the opposite side of the spectrum, what if this person has a lot of physical activity to do throughout the day and no computer work, right? So it's really important to make sure that you're doing an FCE that's very specific to what that person's job entails. What are some cons of a functional capacity evaluation? So again, sometimes an FCE is not comprehensive enough, or they're done in altered environments. So what do I mean by an altered environment? If you look at the picture to the right here, this person is participating in an FCE. There are different machines that kind of help somebody simulate what a job might be. So if I had to guess, this person might be trying to simulate, picking up a heavy bag of sand or mowing a lawn or something that has to do with that position that he's in specifically. However, it looks like he's in a room. There might be 1 or 2 other individuals in there. There's no sun shining. There's no music playing. There's no distractions around him, right? So when an FCE is done in an altered environment, it really doesn't capture all of the different things that are going on for this individual to truly return to work. If it's somebody that works in construction and their FCE is done in a quiet, air-conditioned room, that sounds lovely, and they might be doing really good from a physical standpoint on that. However, again, it does not take in, all of those environmental, all those social factors that really might make the job demands a lot harder when they are actually returning to work. Another thing about FCEs is they are typically only taking into account physical and cognitive factors related to the individual. So again, those personal and social factors I discussed in the beginning, right? Is that person mentally, psychologically ready to return to work? Do they have the support of leadership? Do they have the support of family and friends? These play a large role into somebody's ultimate readiness to return to work. So if somebody just has a functional capacity evaluation done and they get all the stars aligned, they look great, that is a great first step, but it is extremely important to, evaluate and discuss their psychological readiness and really make sure that there's a conversation with that injured worker to understand how they feel from a readiness standpoint. The next one, speaking of readiness, is readiness for return to work scale. So the readiness for return to work scale, it's a pretty simple scale. It's a list of questions with scaled responses for an injured worker, talking about their personal feelings of going back to work, their work readiness, and then their self-efficacy if they're already back to work. So how are they doing? Do they feel they're doing a good job? Do they feel like they're in the right job now that they are back? So an example statement is, you've found strategies to make your work manageable so you can return to work. And the scale is strongly disagree to strongly agree. So what are some qualities about this assessment that are positive, and what do we think are missing? So I'm gonna state a few, and then I would like anybody to kind of put into the question box a statement or a question about the readiness for return to work scale. So in my mind, a scale is wonderful because it is, again, a standardized way of getting answers. However, it's always important to follow up with a scale by asking more questions. When I fill out a scale myself, there are plenty of times I always mark the middle answer, sometimes agree, right? Because sometimes you might be intimidated, or you might not truly know or have a opinion about that question. So it does not paint a full picture at times as far as, what is their readiness for return. So I'm going to pop up this question box and see. I'm going to take a break for a second. If anybody has questions about what I've discussed so far, feel free to put it in the question box. But I'd also like you to potentially make a statement on, pros and cons of this readiness for return to work scale now that I discussed it briefly.
Yes, so far nobody has commented, so we are looking to our audience to give us an answer to that.
Very subjective, I completely agree.
Thank you, Daniela.
Wishy-washy, definitely. Good. Well, exacerbation of complaints. That is true. Absolutely.
It's so good to get people to participate.
Absolutely. No true measure. Yeah. It's hard to measure somebody's readiness with a scale. Like people are saying, it is extremely subjective. It's wishy-washy. Their motivation, but there's a big missing piece in it. Only a snapshot. Absolutely. I think it also, is it's a good reminder to say there are so many scales out there, but it's important to measure multiple different factors at multiple different periods of time. So just doing the readiness for return to work scale once, what if that person's having an off day, right? That really plays a role into what their responses might be. What if they, are really looking to return to work and aren't ready, but their personal or family life is stressing them out. They just need to get out of the house. They might, be using that to really influence their responses to go back to work, even though they are not ready.
Yeah, that goes to Barbara's point here, where you can't measure somebody's personal feelings and answers. Really can't do that.
Yep, exactly. Wonderful. Thank you for all of that participation, and feel free to keep putting things in there. All right, so our third objective is discuss the frequency of communication methods and work modification strategies to promote long-term return to work success. So we'll talk about some communication methods initially. What are different modification strategies that people can implement? And then kind of how do we see long-term return to work success? So with communication in general, there really needs to be a balance between, under communicating and over communicating. And it's a really fine line. It really is, individual to individual. A person might have been injured on the job, and their family is very protective of them, and you don't want to overstep your boundaries and communicate too much. And on the other side of the coin, if you're under communicating, you don't want them, the injured worker, to feel like they aren't being supported, or they don't feel like they have a good understanding of what their rights and abilities are when it comes to return to work. So it's important to understand what that just right communication is throughout the process, right? What is the communication style, and how often do you communicate upon initial injury? How often do you communicate during the recovery process in the hospital, a rehab program, etc.? And then how much do you communicate upon return? You want to make sure they feel comfortable and confident once they return to work, so you aren't overbearing, but at the same time need to be fully supportive to really make sure that it is a long-term return, because many times somebody might return too soon, ends up leaving because they don't feel like there's enough communication about what their rights are, what their work modification is, things like that. So what are the stages of communication? Effective communication with injured workers is a nuanced art that demands a combination of empathy, active listening, transparency, and carefully chosen language. So I really liked that quote from the article that I read about, workers' compensation and communication in general, because it's really important, obviously, to show that empathy and to really listen to that injured worker and to the family. It is an intimidating process, and the injured worker likely hasn't been in this process before. If they have, they might have an idea of how it works, but really listening to what their concerns are, their complaints are, and making sure that you have an open door for that. I would see a lot of times injured workers might not know what questions to ask. So along with the active listening, it's important to help them kind of generate the right questions, because you want to make sure that they have all the information out front at the beginning. So, if they're a little shy or they don't know the right questions, they're not going to get the information that they need to get. So if you work with injured workers, it is really beneficial to say, a lot of times I've worked with injured workers in the past, and it's important that you ask this with your healthcare provider, or, you really want to make sure you're ready to return to work. I think it would be beneficial for you to work with this therapist, or, work on this for a period of time. Do you have any questions about what we discussed? So really to help them understand the process a little bit better. It's okay to have that back and forth conversation. Being transparent about the whole situation is equally as important, if not the most important part of this process. So really making sure that you're truthful about it, and then carefully chosen language, of course, to make that injured worker feel comfortable. So again, it is a process throughout the initial injury, the rehab process, and their return. So if the injury occurred less than 24 hours ago, right, you want to make sure that the information is quick and efficient. Oftentimes, you might be communicating with the family members and not the injured worker themselves, depending on the situation. And it's really important that at that time you are implementing active listening and your support throughout it, because you don't want any more stress to fall on that injured worker while they're dealing with this initial stage of injury. You want them to focus on themselves, not worry about their return, and it's important that that is communicated. 1 to 7 days post-injury, checking in with the injured worker or family, again, if appropriate, of course. It all depends on who that is, what their communication style is. You never want to be overly communicative, but it's important that you show your support. And then the point of contact at work, like a manager, is made known to everybody involved. So this is really important when it comes to a really large company, of course, because when it comes to the family trying to get in touch with the right person, you really, really want to make sure that there is that single point of contact. If there's multiple different people, that is very intimidating, and ultimately there might be some mixed messages there. So having that single point of work contact will really help to streamline everything. Again, what is the style of communication? Being very transparent. and not using too much jargon. So making sure that the family and the injured worker understand exactly what you're talking about. 1 to 3 months post-injury, making sure that the plan is discussed amongst all of those involved. So those involved, it might be insurance, therapists, physicians, injured worker and family, representative, attorney. So they're, the team seems to grow over time, which isn't a bad thing. There are, there's plenty of people in the mix, but it becomes a more confusing process. The only way to make sure that everybody's on the same page is to make sure that that communication is streamlined amongst everyone involved. Communication style at that point is, of course, empathy and then an open door policy. So at this period of time, an injured worker might be starting to get ready to go back to work. On the other side of the coin, it might be an injured worker that had a very catastrophic injury, and this person is just getting out of the hospital and rehab program. So again, seeing where that specific person is at that period of time and making sure they feel very comfortable with communicating with the workplace as far as, what their benefits are and when they will return to work. And then 3 to 6 months post-injury, talking about the modified duty plan or implementing it in the current practice. So, in the research, typically that is the timeline for a return, unless it is a very serious catastrophic injury. You might be looking at 6 to 12 months or 12 months plus for return to work. It's very important to discuss the modified duty plan with the injured worker, make sure they're comfortable and confident with it. And then if you've already started to implement it into their everyday, make sure that it's something they're comfortable with it too. So you can't just give them a modified duty plan and say, good luck, thanks for coming back to work, right? You need to go through those checks, make sure that they feel comfortable throughout, even if it's been, 6 months, 12 months after you have accepted them back to work. So communication style at that point, guidance and acknowledgement of their challenges. So with every injured worker, it is very individualized and very specific to who that person is and who that injury affected, right? So it's important for you to acknowledge that they are an individual, and even though, certain things like their readiness of return to work, their pain levels, things like that are very hard to measure. You are there to support them in their return to work. So current research also indicates the importance of promoting a stay at work policy versus return to work, which I thought is interesting. I still use the term return to work because that is the primary focus of this presentation. But it is, an interesting idea to talk more about stay at work. There is plenty of time when somebody will return to work and then say, this is too much for me, I can't do it, or they return to work and they aren't as efficient. They're kind of doing their job, but they're not doing their job because they're dealing with all of these physical, cognitive, emotional challenges after their injury. So stay at work is a really, interesting new term to say, what can we implement to help you stay, to retain you, to make sure you're happy, to make sure that the job demands are in line with what you're able to do right now. So what are the key factors for influencing stay at work? So effective communication amongst all the parties involved. Again, like I said, sometimes those parties grow and grow and grow over time. It's very important that when a new person jumps on board, right, a new representative, what have you, that there's communication amongst everybody, because you want to make sure that that injured worker feels comfortable speaking to everybody that's involved in his or her care. And likewise, you want to make sure that the communication is generalized amongst everyone involved. You want to make sure there's an understanding amongst all parties regarding work restrictions or modified duty. So, it's important for not only the injured worker to understand what their work restrictions are, but everybody that's on their team, including a lot of their colleagues. Again, with that influence, that social influence, what if a coworker who didn't really know what the work restrictions were said, I'm so tired, I'm so happy you're back, like help me lift this heavy heavy machine, I really need help right now. And that injured worker feels this pull and this loyalty towards that colleague that they've worked with for so long, and they go ahead and do it and they re-injure themselves, right? So instead, making sure that those close to them, including the injured worker, feels comfortable sharing, these are my work restrictions. I can't lift something heavy right now. I'm really sorry. Is an important part of return to work. Likewise with therapists and with health providers in general, a big piece of return to work, surprisingly enough, is making sure that injured workers feel comfortable explaining their restrictions to their colleagues, or in some way just saying, I have to do my own thing. I'm very sorry right now. There is this intimidation piece of not being able to do as much as you once were able to do. So a lot of times when I was working with injured workers in a rehab center, I would kind of do a role play situation and make sure that they're able to implement their work restrictions throughout that. Again, one primary contact at the injured worker's workplace makes everything much more efficient. Management commitment, effective employee culture, workplace culture. So making sure that the employee culture and the workplace culture in general is, is a strong one, of course, making sure the employee feels comfortable going to their manager and explaining if the modified duty program is appropriate for them. Is it too difficult? Is there a restructuring that needs to be happening? An existing inventory of light duty or transitional tasks. So you never want to come up with a modified duty plan after the fact, right? So again, every injured worker is different. I think, their modified duty plan might look very different from, of course, somebody that injured an arm versus a leg, somebody that had a head injury versus a musculoskeletal injury. There is such a wide range of what modified duty might look like, but at the very least, making sure that there is kind of a toolbox, what have you, of what are some tasks that this injured worker might be able to do that are still efficient. He or she is doing their job, but it's modified and they can do it okay. And then the medical provider involvement and understanding throughout the process. So what are some common barriers with stay at work or long-term return? Again, oftentimes somebody might return and then 3 months, 6 months, 8 months down the line, they take a leave of absence, or they realize they return to work too soon and have to leave again, or they're at work and they aren't, performing as well as they can or should. So what are some common barriers? A big one, especially with catastrophic head injuries, is lack of true insight into difficulty areas following an injury, which can lead to mistakes and errors at work, right? So an injured worker might say, I am so ready to return to work. I'm ready to have something to do. A lot of these injured workers, their work is their life, it's their personality, it's their livelihood, right? So they might be so ready, gung-ho, let's go, but their insight isn't there. They might have a long way to go when it comes to handling the physical and cognitive demands that their work demands. So making sure that there is a measure on insight, that the therapy team is talking to the workplace and to the injured worker, so that the injured worker is at a very good place when they return to work and their insight is there, and they can understand what they can or can't do for their own safety. Another barrier is a lack of readiness to handle the hours required or the stimulation demands. So again, the environment that that person is working in might be very different than, obviously a very quiet rehab or being at home. So they might not be able to handle an 8-hour workday or even a 6-hour workday once they get back initially. And then again, the stimulation of coworkers, son, etc. On the opposite side, if they are working from home, there might be the stimulation of family members around them, animals, pets around them, busy street around them. So there are all these other factors that really do influence somebody's return to work. A lack of structure if they have a work from home position. So, you know, a lot of us might not have a lot of structure, and it really does take you to kind of implement your structured day-to-day routine. I have to call this person, I have to then go to this meeting, then I have to write up this report. If there's no structure for their return to work, they will have a more difficult time returning, and that could lead to a poor performance on typical self-guided tasks. Psychological changes following an injury will lead to increased stress with the job, of course. So, you know, anything related to PTSD, depression, you know, anxiety in general about the injury or being out of the workforce for a long period of time really influence how that person does upon their return. And then the stress of personal or social factors outside of the workplace, right? So, you know, thinking about what if that person is, you know, the breadwinner of their family, and their family's at home with them, and they're really stressed to return to work, but they're not quite ready yet. What if they, you know, don't have support of family or friends, and they really need somebody to talk to because it's a stressful transition back to work, and they don't have that that outlet or that person to talk to. So really, you know, looking at what are the support systems throughout the process of injury to return. So work modification strategies. Number one, and there is just one that I wrote, is finding the right modification plan for the individual. So no injured worker is the same. So again, it's important for workplaces to have, you know, modified duty plans. But when it comes to actually implementing the plan, how can we make it individualized? How can we look at that specific individual, maybe what their personal or social factors are that are influencing their return, maybe their, you know, their injury status and their physical and cognitive abilities, and how can we personalize it to make sure that they are ready for what's ahead of them. So a few modification strategies: same tasks involved with different physical or cognitive requirements, right? So how do we implement that? They might need to, you know, be on the phone for a large part of their day. They're making phone calls often. But what if they're used to holding the phone by their head? Or what if they're used to wearing an earpiece, and that tends to hurt their ear? It hurts their head when they're wearing an earpiece. So a lot of these seemingly little pieces of returning to work end up becoming greater and greater when it really impacts how comfortable they are. So that specific individual, you might say, okay, let me get you a landline, or let me work on what different, you know, techniques we can use for you to communicate with individuals. Maybe it's email, maybe it's voice to text, maybe use speakerphone for a little bit, all different things. Other modification plans, you know, modifying hours, implementing different tasks that they can do with different physical or cognitive requirements, different tasks with modified hours, modification of the environment, right? So if they are hybrid, maybe you say, I want you to work remote. Or on the opposite side, you might say, you know, I think you will really benefit from structure and mentorship, and I think we would like you to come in a few days a week, not as a punishment, but as a way for us to make sure that we are fully supporting you and this difficult transition back to work. An increase in mentorship and communication throughout the day is huge. I think that should be in any modification strategy. And then again, opportunities for discussion and modification of the current plan. So this is probably the most important thing for, again, that long-term return, is making sure that once that person is back and they're on modified duty or maybe full active duty, the conversation is not done. You need to make sure that you are continuously following up with that individual, because there might be a lot of things that they're dealing with that they are nervous to talk about unless it is, you know, it's brought up, and unless they know they won't be penalized by it, there might just need to be a change in structure. So what are some key takeaways to promote long-term return to work? So before and during the injury occurrence, leadership training and education within the workplace needs to occur continuously. So it's super important that that doesn't happen just upon hire. The training should happen while somebody's still working for a company. There are, I'm sure, many injured workers, all of you have worked with, that have been working for the same company for 15, 20, 30 years, right? So these individuals are not going to remember what the training and education is when they were first hired. And oftentimes it changes too, right? So they need to be reminded of what the company policies are. They need to feel like they have a support network around them, so that when an injury, or if an injury does occur, they know how they will get that support. A balance in communication with the injured worker and family throughout the work comp process. Communication, again, is everything, and it's important for both the injured worker and the family to feel very supported. Use of proper assessment tools in preparation for return to work. So I went over 2 very common assessment scales. Again, it's important to go beyond those assessment scales, to ask the right questions, to have the injured worker talk to somebody about the process of return to work, and really look at those personal and social factors that are also really influencing how the person does on those scales and their readiness for return. Practice runs in real life. So this one is so important, and there are plenty of workplaces that really do this, and then other workplaces that might be a bit hesitant. But before somebody officially returns to work, it's so great for them to be able to actually practice what their tasks are in a real life setting, right? Can they go to their workplace with their therapist and actually practice the day-to-day of what they have to do? So this really, really helps to paint a picture of that person's readiness for return. And then advocacy efforts for the injured worker when working with medical providers. So again, with the intimidation factor for injured workers that, have potentially never been in this situation, might not know what questions to ask, they need those advocacy efforts for those that are supporting them through this process to know what questions to ask, to know what therapy they should, be able to get and receive, and just to feel supported throughout this process. Key takeaways to promote long-term return to work. Consistent scheduled follow-ups with leadership and management is huge. Again, an open door policy, making sure that injured worker feels comfortable going in to talk to their manager, going in to talk to leadership, to talk to somebody in their workplace that's really supporting them through this process. The ability to adjust the work schedule even when that injured worker is back. So you never want them to feel stuck, right? What if they have a modified duty and something new comes up? That happens all the time, right? Maybe they didn't have a lot of pain in their initial injury and all of a sudden they are feeling a lot of pain. So making sure that as they are continuing to recover, there is room, to adjust that schedule as needed. And then again, just mentorship support in general. So that was a lot of talking on my end, but I hope all of you got a lot of good information there, and I'd love to answer any questions that you might have.
I don't see any questions listed right now, but I do see people mentioning that you brought up some excellent points, and they answered some of the questions that you had asked, which is great. We love to see that participation. Well, I want to thank you very much, Jenna, for participating in this special series that we have. I know that it's well attended, and people seem to really have gotten information out of this program based off of their remarks. So again, I'd like to remind everybody that we do have additional MacroPro and Friends webinars here at the summer school series. So all you have to do is go onto the MacroPro website and find them. I will say that I am really excited about the last 2 programs. It's just serendipity how it happened. So we're going to be having applicant copy services talk about document retrieval and the way that they see it and how they get their jobs and their assignments, etc. And you will be able to ask some questions during the webinar, much like you were able to do today with Jenna. But the class after that is going to be a defense attorney that is going to talk about how to manage the applicant attorney and the records that they are asking for. So it's going to be interesting to see the two perspectives. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you at the next Macro Pro and Friends. Bye-bye now. Great job, Jenna.
Thank you.